A very warm welcome to you. A warm welcome from Pakhuis de Zwijger to this first edition of Designing Cities for all of Us, Breaking It Down. This year, the extensive two-year activity program, Designing Cities for All of Us, will commence with the support of the Creative Industries Fund, the Netherlands. This program will focus on the role of designers in shaping and creating cities for and by everyone. This program specifically will focus on the role of designers in how designers can contribute to the creation of inclusive cities. Because in the context of the super diverse city, how can you design that everybody feels welcome, that everybody feels in a city of belonging, as we would call them? A city where everyone is invited to feel at home. Not only in a spatial sense, but also with regard to the digital domain and relating to the design of our public systems, services and products. Today, we will be starting a series of 3 live casts in which we will analyze the separate elements of designing cities for all of us. And it's about designing, it's about cities, and it's about inclusion in the sense of for all of us. In this first edition tonight, we will discuss the concept of designing. We're going to explore that with 2 guests here in our studio and 2 guests that will join us through Zoom. Here behind me, you can see the dates of the several programs, and I will refer to that later on in the show as well. If you would like to contribute to our program, that is possible if you log in on the program page to Zoom. On www.deswijger.nl, you can log into the program page, and if you're in Zoom, you've got 2 options. With the Q&A function, you can chat amongst each other, and with the program maker of Pakhuis de Zwijger. With the chat function, you can do that. With the Q&A function, you can pose questions to our guests here. Make sure that you know that you mention who the question is designed for, regarded to, and I can make sure that the right person gets the right question. Well, let's get to work. Design. Design is everywhere, and everything is designed. Thus, the job title of a designer encompasses hundreds of industries, job titles, and career paths. What is design, and what does that comprehend? And how does design influence our daily life? How do we design, and what skills are needed, and what does it take to be the actual person doing the designing? That is what we're going to talk about tonight. Our first presentation will be held by Rudy Van Belkham. Rudy is a researcher, he's an innovator, he's a speaker and author in the field of technology and democracy. He's also the founder of Design for Transition, a futures and research design agency. And he will tell us more about designing. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to talk to you about design for transition, or how design can change society. But first things first, we have to look at what is design, because there are designers everywhere. And I bet you know at least one designer for yourself. A graphic designer, a social designer, a human-centered designer. There are lots of them. But when we break it down, I think design can be 3 things. It can be an outcome. So like a tangible product, for example, a chair or a table, or less tangible like graphic design, brand design, a logo. But it can also be a process of coming to new innovations in a more creative manner, in finding solutions for wicked problems, so to speak. But it can also be a culture. It can be about how an organization is structured in order to get more innovative designs, more creative ability of employers or as the company as a whole. So in terms of definition, you could say it's about product design when it's an outcome. It's about design thinking when it's a process. And it's about design management when it's about the culture. And a lot of the times, the design staircase is used to explain what design is, but the staircase suggests that it's hierarchy. There are different levels, but I don't really believe in those kinds of hierarchies. I think it's about co-creation. So the different ways of designing need to work together. And especially in the middle, there is a little sweet spot. There is where change can actually happen. So we need change at the moment, because well, society has a lot of tensions at the moment. And I believe that everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned. So not only the tables and chairs around us, but also societal systems and structures. So that's why I founded Design for Transition. It's about applying design principles to challenge and innovate outdated systems and contribute to a more sustainable future, both socially as ecologically. And a really important thing here is, I talked about the different tensions in society. It's about climate change. It's about the way we should treat the COVID situation. It's about problems like racism, discrimination, etc. But one important thing I would like to point out is bad behavior is ultimately caused by a bad system, not by bad people. So I would like to repeat that one more time. Like, bad behavior is ultimately caused by a bad system, not by bad people. So we need to change the system. And, well, you could say, well, let's fuck the system, right? The system sucks, it needs to change. But in that regard, the system is your enemy. And when we talk about innovation, we don't need enemies, right? You could say, let's beat the system. But in that perspective, the system is your opponent. And co-creation is not really useful when it comes to opponents. So I believe in innovating the system. We need the system as a partner to co-create. Because change is evolution, you need the old system to get to the new one. So instead of beating the system, we need to embrace it. We need to look at the old system not as a problem, but as a way we can change, a way to innovate. Don't throw away all the things, because there are good things in the system as well. We don't need to change all of it. We need to improve it. And it's good that we at least imagine that we are all part of this system. So the system, it's not just the government or politics. We are all part of this system. And when we look at transition design, as you could call it, it's a bit theoretical, but you need to look at 3 different layers when we think about change. You have the bottom-up, the niche innovations, where grassroots movement try to change and break maybe even the systems or innovate. You've got the regime, which normally is called the system, and like I said, it's not only the government, but it's also the industry, it's also technology, it's also science, etc. And you have the landscape. It's about social trends. And if we want to change the regime, the traditional system, we need influencers from all sides. So we need pressure from bottom up, but also from top down. So an example, I tried this in practice because, like I said, it's theory, but we need to the proof is in the eating. We have to look at the different aspects. And as a citizen, I wasn't really appreciating our voting system. So I thought, everything is designed. Why can't I just redesign the voting system? It is possible. So I started this grassroots movement. It's called the New Vote. And I thought, okay, maybe we need a modular voting system. So not voting for just one party, but voting for different parties we need within every theme. So for example, if you agree on defense with party A, but you agree on party B for education, you could compare. You could create your own modular vote in a way. So I was starting to create new voting aids or voting compasses in a way to show that people are not just left or right. We have different positions on different themes. And that's why I'm trying to pressure the system. But from above, you can see in the landscape, the social economic trends, etc. You see globalization, you see polarization, and you see a lot of distrust. So from both sides, there is some pressure on the system now. And from within, you see that people are willing to change. More and more civil participation is embraced. So when you push the two things together, change is possible. And even a new voting system is possible. So I would like to conclude with the following. We are all designers, or maybe better, we are all redesigners. Not only if you are like a graphic designer or a product designer, not even if you have the title of designer, you are part of a system. Even when you have distrust, if you don't feel heard from by the government, etc. If you express your distrust, if you express your opinion, you are setting something in a movement. And that's why it's really important to be that redesigner, to be engaged, and to start thinking about possible solutions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rudy. Thank you for your presentation. And there's a quick question I would like to ask you as well. And later on you can join us at the table. But it's not about designing a solution for a problem that occurs or a system that is broken. It's also designing the transition, if I'm correct. Designing the transition, that's fairly new for a lot of people. Can you elaborate a little bit on what it entails to design a transition?
Well, a transition is the movement I described when you have like the current situation. There's a regime, there's a government, there's science, there's technology, etc. There are different things happening, but for example, there can be distrust. But at the same time, you see at the bottom, you see these niche innovations. You can also compare it with, for example, the energy system. When you look at the landscape, you see high energy prices, you see climate change, and you see a lot of, well, let's say people are aware of a problem. A bigger movement is aware of a problem. Then at the bottom you see, and not bottom like a level, but at the grassroots movement, but also more like social innovation, you see a lot of different types of innovation starting to occur, which are more sustainable. For example, solar energy, etc. So from both sides, there is pressure on the system. And in a way, the transition which is needed is not just to say, okay, we have green energy now. It's good, but it's not the system itself of generating, converting, and using energy hasn't changed. So the whole transition needs to oversee all of those different things. And that's why it's complicated, yes, but it's necessary. So when I started developing this new voting system, for example, it was in 2015, and I already said, okay, I need 20 years to make a change. Yeah. And a lot of people say like, you're not really, or you're crazy, right? And I'm like, maybe, but a regular system change, a transition, it takes about 15 to 20 years. So we need a little patience, but we need not to give up because it is possible. Perfect. Everything was designed.
We'll talk about that a little bit later, and please do join us on stage, because in the meantime, I can introduce our next guest, who joins me at the table here right now. Because as a creative thinker and as a purpose-driven architect, business developer and marketeer, Nyasha Harper-Michon, that's you, strives to lead by example, empower and incite others to act for a resilient, sustainable and circular future. And you see yourself as an archetypist? Do I pronounce that correctly?
Archivist.
Archivist. What is an archivist?
So I'm really happy to be here and an archivist. So I like to think of archivism as a kind of movement that strives for a world where the building industry really contributes to like positive change in the economy, in the environment, in society. And so an archivist is just any design professional within the architecture field who's working towards reform, working towards positive change, and trying to make an act and do something.
Right. You've heard Rudy's story. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I find it really interesting. What I like about what you're saying especially is this idea that everything's been designed and that you can redesign it. I think we feel that things are sort of set in stone and that they are the way that they are, but there's this sort of empowering feeling of thinking of yourself as a redesigner or a designer, and just realizing that you can have a means of changing the world around us, and yeah, it's very empowering. So I thought that was really great.
And what's your criticism? Because we do need that.
My criticism, that's a good question. No, I think it's just, like you said, the aspect of it being something that takes time, I think is something that it's hard for people to kind of get on board with. And so that's the challenge, of course, to try to deal with change over a long period of time and sticking with it. So that's the only thing that's always an issue with this. We want rapid change, or...
Is that possible? I mean, there's a strange juxtaposition that we're sometimes in, because people do say, well, give it time and it will change in the end. So even designing the change is not even necessary because it will change anyway. What's your position on that?
I would argue that you always have to do something. Things won't change just if we just let things happen. I mean, I guess eventually they might, but it's usually because there's someone else who's really taking on the action and to do something, to empower others to do something. We need people, we need role models, we need fighters, activists, archtivists to go ahead and kind of help the movements go on for change to happen.
Right. You wrote a thesis, and there you wrote about place-responsive design methods. What is a place-responsive design method?
So for my thesis project, for my MArch, I looked at how we could think of redesigning the way that we design. So very much in line with what Rudy was saying. Instead of just doing a regular architecture project, I wanted to think, how do we design things? And one of the ways of really making an impact in my mind is starting with place. Place is something that I sort of break into different categories, the categories of sustainability. So that's the environment, so everything that's physical, you have the climate, all the things that you can feel that are more tangible. Then you have the society part, which is really the human aspects. And in terms of architecture, it's how people relate to space, the psychological relationship to it, history. So this added layer. And then an economy for architecture is really the materials, the craftsmanship. And so looking at these three aspects of a place, of a site, when starting with architecture, I think is really important to kind of get immersed in what's going on there and take that as the building block, let's say, for your design. And this was the idea of getting into this and coming up with a new way of designing. So not only looking at the outcome. But there's a question
about that, because I'm rushing a little bit because we have so little time and there's a lot of that I want to discuss. Because you've got examples that I want to talk about a little bit later. But these principles that you mentioned, there's no architect in the world that doesn't, think that those principles are important. Why is it special to have them, highlighted?
So I think that the idea here is really looking from a perspective also of data gathering. So in design, lots of people also work with intuition, which I think is great, like using your own experience and your own way of thinking. But this is really sort of gathering data from the site and things that are also like soft data that can be really important. So how if people, for example, I think Leongo in one of the talks that you guys had was talking about shoes just in the doorway or in the built space. So really looking at how people use space and sort of gathering all that information.
But the short of it, and like I said, I'm rushing a bit, is that you shouldn't, as an architect, you shouldn't put yourself in the central position, but you should use the end user in the central position. And there's an example that when you design bathrooms that I would like to talk about. Can you share your experience with that?
Yeah, sure. So it was I was listening to a podcast basically, and I came across this transgender person who said that they were having a lot of trouble with public bathrooms. And they were saying that, it's hard to find a place to use in public buildings where you can feel safe. And I was in the midst of designing a bathroom for a public building. And I had done a very sort of gender normative bathroom, and
using fuchsia as a tile color, right?
Fuchsia tiles for the women, navy blue tiles for the men. It was very sort of gender normative, and I realized that as a designer, I was also having a role to play in how people would feel in this. And I thought, I didn't think much of it before that, but hearing this other person's experience that was different to mine, I was exposed to something different, and I realized that as a designer, I have to, be open to other ways of thinking, other ways of experiencing space, and incorporate that in design.
But at the same time, who do you exactly listen to? Because there is also a group of transgender people who say, I do not want to have all access bathrooms of no gender because I chose a specific gender. I identify with that specific gender. So that's where I want to go to and who I want to be identified with as well. So, if you listen to those voices, you could go back almost to those normative fuchsia and blue tiles in order to create separate bathrooms. Who do you listen to and how do you decide that?
I think it kind of goes to redesigning things that, like, everything's designed, we can redesign it. Like, we can just think of bathrooms in a different way than they are today. And it's not only about one marginalized group, let's say, it's also just about creating something that's inclusive for everyone, for a parent who's going in a bathroom with a child of the opposite sex or something, just so that everyone just feels comfortable. And if there is no
But again,
male,
you're an architect and you cannot please everyone.
You can't please everyone, but I think it's important to try to create more inclusive design. And through inclusive design, you realize that it actually solves a lot of issues for other people who weren't thinking about certain things. I mean, having one bathroom than two takes a lot less space. It's more efficient, let's say. So even for clients, it could be a really
devil's
good
advocate.
thing.
If you listen to everybody, if you try to be completely inclusive, it's watered down, and your vision as an architect is, watered down as well. What would your response to that remark be?
It's always coupling, the artist voice or the artistic voice of the designer with the users, with the place, with everything that's going on. It's always a mix, and you'll never be able to please everyone, of course, but it's important to go beyond yourself and your own experiences and be open to other things.
Rudy, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I believe as a designer, you have also a responsibility, right? So, I mean, change is not comfortable. I mean, even if you're a designer, it doesn't matter, change is not comfortable. So as a designer, you have a responsibility to make change more comfortable. So I don't think it's about choosing sides. But again, comfortable for whom?
Because in a sense, it's always about choosing different kinds of groups. What the response was with the National Railway here in Holland, when people decided not to say ladies and gentlemen, but dear travelers, there were people that felt robbed by mentioning and by using another title, which is, in my mind, ridiculous. But still, people do feel that. Who do you cater to?
I think attitude, you can look at it like as a normal division, right? So 20% is always against. It doesn't matter what you do, they will always be against. 20% is always in favor. Doesn't matter, change, let's do this. It's about the group in the middle. That's the most important focus group, I guess, because the people who are against everything, they will change eventually. I mean, in the 90s, they said, okay, no more smoking in the train or something. People were like, oh no, this cannot happen. Can you even imagine today someone smoking in the train? Also, people who were against it, they will, for them, time will heal. But I think the most important group is a lot of times also a big group. Not the most important group, but...
But are you designing for the masses? No, you're not, because that's not what Nyasha just
No, I'm not talking about the masses per se, but I think we need to take into account that there is a small group who is always against, and there's a small group who's always in favor.
Right.
So you can't listen to everyone's voices. And within the mass, there are segments. And you need to look at the different segments, of course. So I'm not saying mass consumption or mass, and let's forget about the small group. That's not what I'm saying. But if you look at attitudes towards change, then a small group is always against, and a small group is always in favor.
Right, but then again, we're talking about designing, and I think it's very important to define it. And I noticed that there's a conflict in myself, because again, what you said, Nyasha, which I agree with completely, is you should not put yourself central in designing. But what you do is, if you look at the end user, there's always one end user or a couple of end users that you have in mind, and that's excluding other people as well. And if we talk about designing cities for all of us, shouldn't we say in this first episode that is impossible? Or what should we do with it?
I don't think it's impossible, but maybe you want to.
No, I don't think it's impossible either. It's also the fact that a city is multiple-fold. There's lots of buildings, there's lots of spaces, so not every space is catered for everyone, because that makes no sense. I completely agree with you. So it's just keeping the city as a whole to be inclusive for everyone, but within it, there's pockets where different people will find their happiness.
I think in the end, it's about freedom of choice, right? So design shouldn't be invasive, like you need to make that or that decision. It's about freedom of choice. And it's the voting system I was talking about, it's more modular. It's more like you have to feel the space and to say, okay, this is my opinion, this is what I believe in, and there's room for that. Without excluding things.
Right.
But it's freedom of choice, I guess.
Freedom of choice. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, because I would like to introduce our next guest. As an academic, an educator, an annotator, a researcher, and a technologist. Nishant Shah conducts work on the cutting edge of technology, identity, and social and political movements. He's the Director of Research and Outreach and Professor of Aesthetics and Culture of Technology at the Artist University of the Arts. And he's joining us here through Zoom. Are you there?
Yep, right here.
A very warm welcome to you, Nishant. Things are getting very, very complicated, as as you just noticed. My first conclusion 5 minutes ago was you cannot design cities for everybody. Please, can you show us some light in this tunnel? Can you enlighten us a little bit more with your presentation?
That sounds like a really good spot to begin, though I must confess that I don't think I'm going to resolve the question. If anything, I think I'm going to add to the confusion and the disturbances in the force that you already started noticing. Because I'm going to focus today on the role that questions play in the practice of design, right? Because there is this celebration in speculative design about the need to ask questions. However, I want to make it very clear that the intention of the question makes a distinction between what design can do and what design should do. And the question we choose gives different answers. For example, how do we keep our cities safe? Exciting question. The solution is going to depend on who do you want to keep safe and from whom. I want to propose that questions have meanings not because of what is said, but because of what they are a symptom of. And let me illustrate this through 3 of the most trending questions of the last 5 years. The third most trending question online in the last 5 years was, is this dress black and blue or white and gold? Now, I don't know if you were passionately invested in this debate, but you should know that within the scope of 48 hours, 2.4 million tweets were about this question from 100 different media channels included. The second most trending questions in the last 5 years was whether Hello Kitty is a cat or not. Because Sanrio, the company that holds the rights to Hello Kitty, announced that she's not a cat, but a young girl whose first name is Hello and the last name is Kitty. And if we had paid attention to it, we would have realized this because Hello Kitty, in fact, has a pet cat. So the internet went berserk, childhoods were broken, there were passionate arguments on Reddit, geeks were digging out every piece of history around Hello Kitty to argue their points, and the world as we know it apparently changed. And the most intense question, by the way, in the last 5 years was, is coronavirus real? I was trying to think of a clever meme to make about it, but then realized that one of the figures triggering it is in fact already a meme, so I don't have to do my work over there. So these questions are funny, right? They are silly, they are sometimes trivial. But it's obvious that the most important thing in these questions is not the content, but the larger truths that they indicate. Because the blue dress, gold dress controversy, for example, was already showing us the beginning of a post-truth moment where we can no longer trust our own senses. The revelation that Hello Kitty is not a cat was pointing towards an end of history and the capacity of rewriting truths which can be collectively experienced but overturned because of design manipulation and information settings. And the reason why coronavirus is trending despite people dying all around us was simply because we have reached a stage where we can find evidence for everything we believe in rather than believing in things because we have an evidence for it. So really, the very simple point that I'm trying to make for us is that it's not the content of the question, but the authority of who asks it, the intention and the purpose behind that question that eventually produces the design brief. And it's perhaps important to introduce 2 principles into this equation, which might help us make things more concrete. The first one is that the personal is the political. Now, listen, this is not perhaps the most revealing statement. You all have seen a meme around this sometime or the other. But it still bears expanding upon because the idea of asking a question, especially when it comes to design thinking and design management, often looks at the personal without realizing the political dimensions of it. Let me take the example of public safety for women. In 2018, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Gender and Sexual Violence in the Netherlands told us that 37% of women in the Netherlands had experienced gender-based violence in public spaces in the Netherlands. So we know that our public spaces are not equally safe for everyone. Design solutionism to safe public spaces followed 2 tropes largely. One was to start empowerment campaigns so that the women can look after themselves. So you make the women responsible for their own safety. Or two, you create special spaces for women, right? So train compartments, bars, parking places where they can be selectively kept safe. This is not designing of environments where they can be safe. This is designing of bodies so that they can be kept safe. The second principle I want to just give it to you is a hashtag which has been doing a lot of rounds, which is check your privilege. Because every time you as a designer are able to ask a question, to imagine a different reality, to think of an alternative, to challenge the status quo, check your privilege because it is one. Because when you ask a question, you're asking a question of you are putting them to a scrutiny that they might not be able to stand up to. Questions are not innocent. They come with a critique. Every week of living in Europe for the last 7 years, I have been asked this question: where are you from? When I say Germany or Netherlands, there is a small pause, and then it's followed by no, but where are you really from? The second question invalidates my own story and experience of who I am and where I live and make me into an outsider. Communities who are in a minority particularly face these questions. Where are you really from? Do I call you a he or a she? Who is the woman in this relationship? Which bathroom would you want to use? Questions are attacks. And when you set out to question others from your own bubble, make sure you realize that you are exercising your privilege and need to be careful not to use it to demean or diminish the other. Sarah Ahmed has a wonderful book called The Promise of Happiness and reminds us that if the end point of your question is happiness, then anybody who is unhappy will automatically be eliminated from your final solutions. Your questions can sometimes, in fact, be acts of intimidation, and we need to really work at converting them into inquiries of care. As my colleague Alexandra Yuhas points out, what we need to move away from is questions of harsh realities and start discussions around gentle truths, because questions have consequences. And that's where I will leave you today, that when we do talk a lot about questions and the capacity of design to ask critical questions, but these questions often stem from conditions of power, and they also reproduce the status quo. That some bodies are questions, some bodies are questioned, and some are made invisible in the acts of asking a question. And so perhaps we need to start talking about questions and instead start talking about care. And that brings me back to where I began. When we talk about what design can do, we are asking about the act of questions. When we start talking about what design should do, we're talking about care. And care needs us to think of the bodies, voices, and people who are often made invisible in the acts of asking questions. Okay, I'll stop here, and hopefully there'll be some provocations and more confusion stemming from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, I think it's happily I'm still confused, but not more than I already was. In that sense, that one of the key remarks of your talk is, of course, it's not about the content of the question; it's about who asks the question. And for me, that also says that it's important to decide who has a seat at the table. In order to hear everybody, you should invite everybody, or have a structure to invite everybody to pose questions. And how do you do that, Nishant? Have you got an answer to that?
Well, I think this is where things become slightly complicated, right? Because a lot of our understanding of participatory design, collaborative design, and so on are about involving people either as native informants or as people who have special information that we need to accommodate within the kind of design practice that we are building. So when you start that, you begin by acknowledging difference. Perhaps there is a different way of shaping it, saying let's begin by acknowledging similarity and affinity. Not what we are fighting against, but what we are fighting for. Is there a collective purpose? When you have to start defining whether bathrooms are going to be male or female or heteronormative and patriarchally determined or not, it's not about pleasing somebody or offending somebody. It's about recognizing that we are trying to build an inclusive space which is not hostile to different kinds of people, and you being offended is not the same as you being discriminated against. If you are to weight between two different things, saying one person's being offended and the other is discriminated against, the people who are being offended can go and eat pickles. It's fine. Because what we are looking at is an intersectional hierarchy, and you cannot pretend that both of them are the same kinds of problems. So if we begin with affinity and a common purpose and say, no, this is what my design brief has to do, after that voices become clearer. And then who gets to decide what our design is, what our final purpose is going to be a variety of stakeholders, and you give them the ownership back, right? That's the most interesting part of it. Not who gets to design and who gets to just be a part of the usage, but who gets to own the design once it's already set into motion.
Right. In that sense, the way of thinking and inclusiveness is important. And the fact that you can have people that are offended is also very interesting, because that's a very unpopular position to take. What should fundamentally change when we are designing cities? What's your answer to that?
I think that's a difficult question, and there are so many different. I think Taisha already mentioned it. There are so many layers to this entity called the city. But I think the two things that we need to remind ourselves continuously is that cities are lived experiences, which means that the intention of what we design and how it's eventually going to be used are two separate things. And if design can take into account that almost everything that is built will not just be redesigned, but will be queered, will be used against its intention, will be perverted, will be owned and made into fantastic monsters that we had never imagined. That would be the first part. And the second is to realize that often when it comes to design and design briefs, we end up being complicit in defining and perpetuating the myth of individual ownership and private wealth. That the more we in fact orient our design to building commons, not our cities as places where people can buy expensive property, but places where people can live together in different kinds of affordances, reimagining the city not as a space of wealth accumulation, but wealth distribution might be the first step towards this.
Great. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time now for this round is up, but thank you so much. And hopefully, in the end, we've got a moment to talk with each other again. So please stay online. But I would like to introduce our next guest, who's joining us from Melbourne. Because Melis Sinova is a pioneer in human-centered design and a founder of global strategic design consultancy Huddle. Her vast business experience, underpinned by a PhD in human factors, human-centered design, sees her focused on reshaping the super systems of the future. Melissa, are you there?
I am. Hello.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us. It's quite early in the morning in Melbourne. I believe it's about 4:10 in the morning right now.
We're just an hour past that now. It was 4:10 when I joined. So we're just
5:10.
It's 5 o'clock in the morning.
You look incredibly well for 5 o'clock in the morning. but that's not why we invited you, because you've written this book, This Human. Can you tell us a little bit what's it about?
Well, listening to the conversation so far is a really good place to start as to why I decided to write that book, because the notion around everybody is a designer, and because things have been designed and therefore can be redesigned, is something that I agree with. But often those things that have been designed in the first place may not have been done consciously. So not everyone is aware that when they're making a decision, they are engaging in the act of design. And when you work with organizations, whether they're private industries or governments, people are making decisions all the time that affect the reality of other people, whether it's your culture of an organization or the service that citizens are going to be interacting with. People who make these decisions that alter other people's realities are essentially world builders, but they don't know that they are. So except for a small cohort of people who are the people who are sort of in this room and perhaps listening to this conversation, who have opted in to be that person, they are consciously, willingly wanting to be an architect or a designer or an engineer or a service designer, a transition designer. They've self-selected into that. They have an understanding. But then there's a whole bunch of other people who are also making decisions that decide what a building's going to look like, that may not even be an architect just because of the way the brief and the legislation has been put together, who are also participating in the act of design. So I wanted to write a book that explored that. So what does it actually mean to be the person who's doing this type of work? And one of the things, the premise, I guess, that the book is based on is every action by every human creates the world. So it's really important to know who's doing the designing. And what I mean by that is, like, who are you in this? And are you aware of your belief systems? And are you aware of your biases, both conscious and unconscious? And do you have a practice around uncovering that for yourself so that when you are engaging in design, when you are making decisions that affect a shared reality, that you know the influences that are sitting in the background of those decisions and those design actions? So that's why I wrote that book.
Right. But designing is about making decisions, and this human, this human in the title is the designer. They're bound to make decisions, and with every decision, there's somebody who is affected not positively by the decision. How can you make decisions while being aware of the fact that you will, again, not please everybody? How do you do that?
So I really agree with the position that Nishant just posed on that, which is, I first of all feel like we can't enter into the act of designing with the expectation that we're going to please everybody. I actually just don't agree with that. And I feel like it's actually a very arrogant position to think that, because there's so much variety and diversity in the world that it's not possible. But the only thing that we can do as the people who have chosen to do this type of work is to do two things. One is to be really clear on who you are and what influences the way that you perceive the world, and therefore prioritize things and make decisions. And the second is to get as close as possible to the lived experience of those people that you are designing with and for, and to not lose yourself in that, but to not also be projecting your ideals, your views, your perspectives onto the people that you're in collaboration with in the act of design. But I think if we were to go in as a cohort of people who are extremely privileged, who happen to have, started businesses, who've got PhDs, who've done all of this stuff, and kind of going, yep, we're going to design this thing and everyone's going to be happy, I think it's actually a really arrogant position. So I think underneath that, there's this real nuanced position, which is to say, know thyself, know who's doing the designing and what's informing your thinking, and be inclusive as possible to the cohort that you are designing with. And I'm saying that really deliberately. We're not doing it to people, we're not doing it for people, we're doing it with them. And that's it. That's the best.
And one of the things that's for you is very important is the heartfelt connection that you have to make. And you wrote, if you only take away one idea from your book, let it be this, like the heartfelt connection. But how come? Why is it that human-centered designers sometimes forget that they're designing for working people in services of others? How does that work?
I'm giggling because I actually find this quite ironic and funny, because people who choose to do human-centered design are obviously interested in the human condition and want to participate in the betterment of that, perhaps. But also because as humans we're so externally oriented, we can get really, really focused on things that are about task and action and process and function, and privilege that actually when we're designing services. Like if you think about a journey map, it's all about the stages that someone goes through. Or if you think about a redesigning of an organization, we're looking at organizational structures and processes and all of this sort of stuff. And designing for emotion, designing for emotional connection, even though we talk about it in human-centered design, it's not a new concept. It's been around for ages. But in practice, we often don't spend a lot of time in there, because a lot of the time, the actual person who's doing the designing doesn't have a high level of emotional literacy themselves, because they're not sitting in reflection about, well, how is this for me? How am I in this? And that what's inside manifests outside. So that's why I wanted to create this book that just basically put all of these flag posts up to say, are we doing this? Have you considered that? What's happening over here? To really build a more vulnerable practice around design, because that's essentially what emotional connection is.
We will all read your book, of course, but is there any advice, because we're entering the last stage of our conversation, is there any advice that you would give designers in order to make that heartfelt connection, in order to take that emotion in account as well? What kind of advice would you give?
I always start by saying, be a person, not your role. So that is the best place to start, is don't show up as the architect, don't show up as the transition designer, don't show up as the CFO, the CEO, the human-centered designer, just show up as a person.
Can you give an example?
Start there.
Can you give us an example in how that works in practice? How do you be the person?
Sure. So when you enter a room as a designer, everyone in the room looks at you because they know change is about to happen. So they're expecting you to start talking about, the current state, the future state, and how we're going to get there. Instead of starting with that dialogue and positioning yourself to be that person, or play that role, actually take some time to be able to create just human-to-human connection with people in the room. Don't go straight into, okay, everybody, here's the run sheet and this is what we're here to do, and we'll go into redesign. Actually give a little bit of yourself to the room. And that's why I keep talking about vulnerability. It's actually the sort of practice that I like to do around human-centered design is actually a really vulnerable practice, because you're exposing bits of yourself that often we're not kind of wanting to.
Is the world ready for that? I mean, is showing your vulnerability not seen as showing your weakness in a sense? So you can try to be vulnerable, but if it's perceived to be weak, what should you do, or should you take that in account?
Yeah, and I think this is the bit where knowing who you are and what your values are is really important, because the question that I would sort of counter that statement with, or that question with, is who do you want to be in the world? So to be able to share that vulnerability takes an immense amount of courage. So is that the type of person that you want to be in the world, to continue to show up and to share and to be courageous and to be vulnerable? Or do you want to be the type of person who succumbs to the status quo that says vulnerability is weakness? And that's a choice.
Can I play devil's advocate? Because I do agree with you.
Of course.
But I'm not an architect, but if I were an architect, I would say, I want to be successful. So, if vulnerability doesn't work or doesn't give me the right assignments or makes me less successful, I won't be vulnerable at all. I will play the role of know-it-all and having everything in control because I want to be successful. How would you respond to that?
Those people aren't interested in my work, right? So my background, my undergrad is in engineering, and I think this is where my pragmatism really comes in. I'm not out there trying to convert and convince everyone that my way is the right way. I think that's also a little bit arrogant. There are going to be people who continue to exist in the world in the way that they feel is going to have them be the most successful, and they will continue to do that. The reason why I wrote the book and the reason why I talk the way that I do is for those people who have the glimmer, that want to be that type of person in the world but need some scaffolding around them to be able to work out how. They're the people I'm talking to. And it's like that in my coaching practice as well. I work with lots of different people with lots of different motivations. And I've got to the point where I don't work with everybody. Because some people are they're not open, they're not wanting to change. And I think we also need to be quite pragmatic in that view. We can't force, like something that Rudy was saying, there's going to be people who are just never ever going to agree with you. And we can't enforce change on them. We're just having to focus on the people that are ready to make some changes and keep working with them. And then eventually, over time, long-term views, things will shift.
Yeah. Thank you so much for now, Liz. We've reached almost the end of the program, but I would like to give everybody the opportunity to respond. Nyasha, I saw you nodding in agreement several times when Liz was having a talk. What did you identify with, or what did you agree with?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things. It's hard to know which one to talk about, but yeah, just I think this empathetic view and of knowing who you are is really important, of knowing where you come from, and when I say where you come from, not like in terms of the country, but like who you are as a person and what you bring with you, all your baggage, let's say, and think of it in a positive way, but understand that that's what it is, and that.
But again, in this corporate environment that we're often in when we talk about designing cities, do you see room for change, or is that a niche, or is there a new movement starting? How do you perceive that?
I think there's definitely room for change. I think it takes there needs to be a more diverse, we talked about, the questions, who's asking the questions. There needs to be more inclusion and more diversity within within designers in general, because it can be a very one-sided sort of view. And even if it's just the same thought process, we all went to the same schools, we all have a certain way of viewing the world, and it's important to be exposed to something different, to trigger things, and to create a city where we can all find, our place, and where we have choice to live the way that we want. So,
yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Is there anything you would like to add?
I think the biggest challenge is overcoming our biases. I mean, everyone has biases because we are human. And it's really difficult to overcome because you have like this confirmation bias and you have like cognitive dissonance. So we don't like the things that don't agree with us. So it's really difficult to change that, because when we are presented with factual information, it tends to enlarge our belief in our own points of view. So how can we break that? And I think designers also have a big part to play in this. And I think we can also design things that make it more easy to overcome your biases. So I think the book is a great first step, but in the end, it's not that inclusive because not everyone will and can read that. So we also need to think about solutions in practice. And I will make sure I will read the book because I'm excited about it and inspired to make that change.
Right. Melis, go back to you, because overcoming biases is a very important part of the book as well. How do you do that? Because we're not always aware, like Rudy described, of our biases. How do we overcome them?
There's a thing called the overview effect. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. When astronauts leave, they go into space, they look back on the Earth, and they can't see the Earth the same way again. It's a perspective shifting moment. So we need to get people into experiences. And there was one that was given earlier around the bathroom design and listening to the transgender person on the podcast, which fundamentally changed the way that she was conceiving of bathroom design. That surfaced an unconscious bias that was sitting in the background, informing the design decisions about, male and female toilets. What we need to do is constantly be opening ourselves up to these experiences, because it's not, like Rudy was saying, you can't read an exercise in a book and go, I've now uncovered all of my unconscious biases, I'm going to change them now. You can't do that. But what it does is it goes, hey, there's this thing called an unconscious bias that you have. Go out in the world and put yourself into situations that are uncomfortable for you and see what happens. See what you learn about yourself. So the whole point about working with your biases is actually an experiential one. It's not an intellectual one.
Right. Nishant, a closing question for you. You said the personal is political. How can we be more aware of that, and how can we act on that as well?
I think what both Melis and Taisha have been saying is this notion of affective design is something that perhaps we really need to connect to. I also think that a lot of focus when it comes to design has been at the level of epistemology, right? We make things happen. There is a language, there is a vocabulary. But I think the real role of design is ontological. We break open categories, we break open experiences, and we reveal what is hidden within them. So even when we talk about building cities for all, and we say, oh yeah, we're going to build cities for human beings, let's immediately recognize that there is an entire ecosystem of non-human residents who live in the city. Also recognize that in large parts of the world, not everybody is allowed to be human in the same way. That even people who belong to our own species are often considered as less than human and kept out of those spaces. So I would basically say, if we want to think about the personal as the political, we'll have to start designing from spaces of discomfort as opposed to spaces of familiarity. And maybe that's a good beginning point.
But then that makes me curious, because every statement poses a new question as well. How do you design from a position of discomfort? What do you mean by that?
Feminists have kind of worked on this for decades now, and there are many lessons to be learned from both feminist epistemologies of knowledge making as well as from feminist design practice. The first thing to do, and I think Melis really explained it beautifully, is to let go of the idea that you know. And then the second, accept the fact that there will be people who will oppose you, but that opposition does not necessarily trigger a service response where I have to please everybody, but you have really say, this is what my design should do. And once a normative stance has been taken, compromises have to be made. And if some people get offended by it, that's fine. But if there are people who come and say, I'm offended by you protesting for your rights for survival, I'm not going to be trying and pleasing the people who are offended by that. I'm going to side with people who are precarious, vulnerable, and who need me, because that's the kind of designer or an academic or an intellect that I want to be.
Right. And a final question, which I know we don't have the time to solve it, but is the structure that we have in training designers, in giving room for designers and giving designers space, is that system sufficient, or should we change the system completely? Who would like to react to that? Rudy, maybe you?
Well, I think when you look at education, and especially with engineers, etc., there's not a lot of ethics, and there is some like this sub-course about ethics, and the students are like, okay, we'll just take it. But I think there needs to be a way bigger role of all the things we talked about today. Who are you as a designer? What's your role as a designer? What's your impact? Who are you as a person, etc., etc. So I do believe that education is a big foundation of this change. So yes, let's look into that.
Yeah, Nishant, you are an educator. Do you agree with what Rudy said?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that a lot of design education actually comes from places of violence. The entire pedagogy of how you need to break down a person and rebuild them to belong to a specific school, a philosophy, or an idea often excludes people, drops out people who are first-generation learners, drops out people who do not have access to similar cultural affordances. And so an education of care is going to be a critical need. And I'm very glad that at Artes, that's what we've started. We begin by saying that let's begin with empathy, let's begin with nonviolent communication, and let's begin with conditions of care. And then within that, design and education can follow up.
Melis, I see you nodding in agreement. Is there something that you would like to add to that?
I don't really want to add anything. I just really agree with that position. I think design education does need some attention, especially if we want to create the future world builders, for sure.
And what focus should it have in your perception?
Well, declaring my bias, I really feel like the exploration into who you are and how you are influencing the design action, which is what the whole book is about, is missing in design. And I think that's what needs to, I just feel like we need to build that awareness that self-reflective practice is essential to design.
Right.
It's not a separate thing. It doesn't live in social sciences or philosophy.
Yes, it should be included. Nyasha, the final word to you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's important to be self-aware and that this needs to be a part of redesigning design education. And yeah, intuition, diverse experiences, diverse teachers that aren't also designers, different types of people.
And learning how to listen as well, because that's what I take away from your story, is that you have to learn how to listen and go beyond yourself.
To seek, to really go beyond yourself, exactly. To not just stay with what you know, but to look beyond the things that you know, that you can even think of, and be open and empathetic.
Right. Well, I would like to thank you all for joining in this conversation. It's very interesting to deconstruct design almost and see what can be changed. And if I'm correct, there needs a lot to be changed. But if we start in time, maybe we can, as you described at the beginning of the program, do it in 20 years. There are a couple of things. Is 20 years too short? Or is it feasible?
No, 20 years is doable.
To be ambitious.
The best method of research is talk to people. So we can do that every day. We can start today. So we can do it.
Yeah. Well, there are some key takeaways that I'd like to mention at the end of the program as well from each of you. What I understood from you, Rudy, is that you have to have freedom of choice. So don't design one fits all. You have to design like a quilt of all different kinds of ideas and all different kinds of purposes and tastes almost, so that there is a freedom of choice. And Nyasha, like I said, don't put yourself central and create variety and learn how to listen, learn how to go beyond yourself. And if I listen to Nishant, it's not the content of the question that is important. It's a matter of who asks the question, and that should be more inclusive as well. And what I also think is a very not great remark is that cities are lived experiences, which they are, of course. It's not the buildings that create a city. It's the experience, and we should be more aware of how to design those experiences. That it's not an accumulation of wealth, but distributing wealth as well. And design from a position of discomfort, which I think is very challenging, but I'm very curious what can come out of that. And with Melissa, I think it's important to show your vulnerability, to put yourself, to give a little bit of yourself into the process as well, so people can see the person instead of the function. And that is also important not to convince everybody. And it's also important that it's not bad to offend people as well. Well, those are my key takeaways. I hope other people took other things from this as well. But again, thank you for all your insights. We've come to the end of the program, and I would like to focus the attention to next week, because we will talk about cities in this series of Designing Cities for All. And our guests will be Indy Johar, Wouter Pokorny, and Gabriela Gomez-Mont. And here you can see the 3 dates. That's on the 22nd of February, and on the 1st of March, we will have the third part of this triptych, and that has got the title Breaking It Down for All. How do we design for all? And well, we had a little start with that here today as well. Sure. So one person cannot design for all, but many people can make sure that everybody feels at home and welcome as well. To know about more about the program Designing Cities for All, go to deswijger.nl/magazine, and there you will find more information. The book This Human will be available there as well, and you will have a discount code, so you can have it more, beneficial for you. Melissa, did we tell you that we have a discount code? So we're really promoting it.
Yes, thank you.
No, the reason why we did is that I think that everybody here believes that it's very important for everybody to read this, so we would like to make it more accessible for everybody. So the discount code can be found at deswijger.nl/magazine. And the final thing that I would like to say is keep an eye on our website. There you can see the other live casts that will be programmed here as well. And if you would like to make a financial contribution in these challenging times, that is possible. Please go to deswijger.nl/pay, and there you can leave a donation that will benefit the programs directly. This is the end of the program. I will see you next week. Thanks again, and hope you are inspired, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.